My family and fiancé excommunicated me after my sister sabotaged me. I do not even know what to do anymore. My whole world flipped upside down, and I could really use some advice. When I was 21, my fiancé got down on one knee and asked me to marry him. He was everything to me, my best friend, my rock. We had known each other since we were kids, back in preschool, and our families had always been close. He practically lived at my house, having dinner with us every night, just like I did with his family. He was an only child, but I had two older sisters, which was important because he was just as close to them as he was to me. We grew up side by side. When we started dating, our parents were over the moon, celebrating like they had just won the lottery. He helped me through a lot, especially my anxiety. Even when I put on a little weight and my mother tore into me, saying he would leave, he stood up for me. He told her off, saying he loved me for who I was, not what I looked like. And in his eyes, I was the most beautiful girl in the world. We were only engaged for 6 months before everything fell apart. My middle sister, let's call her Nikki, was always distant. She was cold, never affectionate, and never really opened up to anyone except my fiancé. She saw him as a brother, and he had helped her through some dark times, drug addiction, trouble with the law, you name it. She and I never saw eye to eye. I loved her because she was my sister, but as a person, I just did not like her. Out of nowhere, she asked me to go clubbing. She said we had never really hung out, just the two of us, and she felt bad about how distant she had always been. It was weird, but I figured, why not? Maybe she was trying to change. That night, we went out. Clubbing was not my thing, but after a few drinks, I loosened up and started enjoying myself. Everything seemed fine until Nikki spotted some guy across the room. She leaned in and whispered that she wanted to climb him like a tree. She strutted over to him, but a few minutes later, she was back, looking like she had just bitten into a rotten lemon. I asked her what happened, but she just shook her head. I kept pushing because I did not want her night to be ruined. Finally, she blurted out that the guy was not interested in her, he wanted my number instead. I laughed and told her he was an idiot, that there were plenty of guys in the room who would be lucky to have her. But she did not drop it. She said she needed to use the restroom, then we could head home. I nodded and waited, and waited. An hour passed. I kept drinking, not thinking much of it. But then, out of nowhere, I felt dizzy, lightheaded. Something was not right. I decided to leave. Nikki was nowhere in sight anyway. As I made my way outside, I ran into one of Nikki's old flings. He asked if I needed help getting to my car. I told him I was getting a cab, and he said he was about to leave too. We could share a ride. It seemed harmless enough. We stepped into the first cab we saw. I reached into my purse to find my phone, but the dizziness got worse. My head felt heavy, the world spinning around me. And then, nothing. Everything went black. When I woke up, my head was pounding, and I was lying on a hard sofa. As I blinked myself awake, I realized I was in Nikki's friend's apartment. My phone sat on the glass coffee table in front of me, but the battery was dead. He noticed I was awake and handed me some painkillers and water. He explained that I passed out in the cab, and since he did not know my parents' address, he brought me back to his place and let me crash on the couch. I was too out of it to argue. I just told him I needed to go home. He called me a cab, and I left. I barely made it through the front door of my parents' house before I realized something was wrong. My whole family was waiting in the living room, my mom, dad, Nikki, my fiancé, and his parents. Their faces were cold, unreadable. I thought maybe they were worried about me, but the second I opened my mouth, my fiancé exploded. "How could you do this to me?" he shouted. I stared at him, confused. My phone was dead, I had no way to call him. But before I could even explain, he started yelling about how I had cheated on him. I was completely blindsided. Why would he think that? I tried to get my side of the story out, but they kept cutting me off. Then Nikki chimed in, twisting the knife even deeper. She looked disgusted, shaking her head. She called me a liar, said she saw me flirting with guys all night, then watched me leave with her friend. I could barely process what she was saying before she pulled out her phone and showed everyone a picture. In it, her friend had his hand on my back, guiding me out of the club. The angle made it look bad, really bad. But I was so out of it, I had not even noticed him touching me. My fiancé was furious. His mom was crying. My own mother was crying. I turned to Nikki, desperate. "Call your friend. He will tell you nothing happened." She smirked and dialed the number. I held my breath as he picked up. But instead of telling the truth, he fed them a whole different story. He said I begged him to take me back to his place, and once we got there, we slept together multiple times. I lost it. I started screaming at Nikki because I knew she had set this up. She had planned everything just to ruin me. I begged my fiancé to believe me, but he just shook his head and walked out. My mother turned to me, her face filled with rage. Then she slapped me across the face. "Get out," she spat. I was numb. I grabbed my things and left, heading to a friend's place where I crashed for a few nights. I called my fiancé, sobbing, begging him to listen to me. I sent text after text. Nothing. He never answered. Then my mom sent me a message. She told me I was kicked out, that she could not believe I would do something like this. She called me names, things so awful I cannot even repeat them. And just like that, she threw all my stuff out. I was homeless. No one in my family would take me in. They all chose my fiancé's and mother's side. In less than 2 days, I had lost everything. My home. My family. My fiancé. All because of Nikki's lies. I told my dad that my mother had thrown away all my things, but he shook his head and said that was just another lie. Everything was still at the house. I took a deep breath and asked him what had happened to Nikki. His face hardened. He told me she was dead to him, he wanted nothing more to do with her. But my mother? She was still crying over Nikki, begging him to forgive her. My mother told him they had already lost one daughter, and they could not afford to lose another. He had finally had enough. He blocked my mother and Nikki from his life completely. But he had been relentless with my ex, pushing him to track me down. My ex had caved under the pressure. After my dad cut ties with my mother and Nikki, my ex finally gave up my location. I told my dad I needed space. I asked him not to show up at my doorstep again unless I gave him permission. He agreed without argument. Then he asked me, "What happens now?" I shook my head. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I do know that you hurt me. You all hurt me." I finally let out everything I had bottled up, the pain, the betrayal, the heartbreak. I told him what it felt like to see them all happy without me, how I had struggled to survive on my own while they celebrated Christmas together like I never existed. We both sat there, crying. But, for the first time in a long time, I felt lighter. Like I had taken a weight off my chest that I did not even know I was carrying. He wiped his face and told me he wanted to make things right. He knew some places in the area where I could get a better apartment, and he even offered to help me find a higher-paying job. I shook my head. My boss had helped me through so much when I had nothing, and I was not going to walk away now. "I don't want you to do anything for me," I told him. "But I do want to work on this. On us. On my terms." He nodded. "I will do anything to make up for what I did." I looked him in the eye and asked, "Why did Nikki do this to me?" He let out a heavy sigh. "She told me she thought your fiancé deserved better than you. She thought he was making too many sacrifices for you, and she wanted to see him happy." My stomach twisted. "She said she did it out of love," my dad continued. "She loved him like a brother, and she thought breaking off the engagement was the best thing for him." He explained how Nikki had orchestrated the entire thing. She had asked her friend to lead me out of the club and make sure there were pictures to back up her story. Then she set it up so I would pass out at his place, making sure I looked as guilty as possible. But nothing had happened. I had slept on the couch the whole night while her friend played video games. He had proof. It did not matter now. The damage had been done. My dad told me he had planned to collect my things from my mother's house and bring them to me, but I stopped him. I do not want any of it, I said. Then I asked about Nikki's husband. My dad said my mother had been keeping the whole situation quiet, but he had his number. He wrote it down and handed it to me before he left. After he was gone, I stared at the number for a long time. My hands felt clammy. My stomach twisted into knots. What if she was there when I called? What if I heard her voice in the background? But I needed answers. I picked up the phone and dialed. The second he answered, I spilled everything. I should have taken my time, eased him into it, but I just could not hold it in. He was quiet for a long time. Then, finally, he let out a long, slow sigh. Turns out, he already had suspicions about her. He told me Nikki had been driving a wedge between him and his sister, spreading lies and turning them against each other. Things had gotten so bad that his own sister had refused to attend their wedding. I told him I was sorry for dumping all of this on him, but that he needed to make things right with his sister. The problem was not her, it was Nikki. We talked a little longer before he hung up. I do not know what he is going to do with this information, but I hope he leaves her. He seemed like a decent guy, and she had already cost him his own family. As for me, I have decided to reconcile with my dad. For years, my mother had controlled their entire marriage, but now he was finally putting his foot down. He was divorcing her, cutting Nikki out of his life, and trying to make amends. That told me he was serious. But my mother? No. She still saw Nikki as the victim. She still made excuses for her. And at this point, I do not care. If she ever reaches out, maybe I will listen, maybe I will not. But for now, I am done. As for my ex, I have not spoken to him yet. My dad mentioned that he had wanted to come with him when he visited me, but my dad told him it would be too much for me. Seeing them separately would help me think more clearly. Oh, and my ex? He was arrested. Apparently, after finding out the truth, he tracked down Nikki's friend, the one who had lied about me, and beat the living hell out of him. He got arrested for assault, but the charges were dropped after a few days. I do not know if I will ever talk to him again. But if I do, I will update you all. Thank you for listening. I have been carrying this story inside me for far too long.